Coming up next, it's Space Ghost Coast to Coast, followed by Gumby on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Batman, followed by Beetlejuice on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Freakazoid, followed by Two Stupid Dogs on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Two Stupid Dogs, followed by Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory, followed by Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Hungry for more? Next, the Cartoon Weekend continues right here on Cartoon Network. Coming at you next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, followed by Animaniacs on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Johnny Bravo, followed by Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's...
Hello? Powerpuff Girls, you're not gonna believe this. The Gangrene Gang, Mojo Jojo, Fuzzy Lumpkins, and him are fighting right here in my office.
Yeah, right, Mayor. Very funny.
No, Blossom, he's not kidding. You've got a long night ahead of you. Powerpuff Girls continues right here on Cartoon Network. Oh, Jiminy.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Bravo.
Yes, Mayor?
Emergency!
What? Gross.
Get downtown!
Do we have to? Okay. Something's bugging the town. Let's roll.
Hurry, girls, hurry! We'll just have to see Johnny Bravo another time. You got a town to save. I'm sure he'll understand. It's the Powerpuff Girls, next.
Coming up, Cartoon Network's greatest cartoon countdown continues, followed by the Acme Hour here on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Cartoon Network's greatest cartoon countdown continues, followed by Road Rovers, only on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Godzilla, followed by Super Friends on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Flintstones, followed by Cartoon Network's Cartoon Theater on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Alvin and the Chipmunks' Greatest Hits continues, followed by the Flintstones on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Animaniacs on Cartoon Network. Look what's coming up next. It's Road Rovers, followed by Freakazoid on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Beetlejuice, followed by Two Stupid Dogs on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, followed by Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ed, and Eddie, followed by Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Bugs and Daffy Show, followed by Tom and Jerry on Cartoon Network.
Look what's next. It's Toonheads, followed by Space Ghost Coast to Coast on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry, followed by Johnny Bravo on Cartoon Network. Coming Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy, followed by Cow and Chicken on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, followed by the What a Cartoon Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Space Ghost Coast to Coast, followed by Oh Canada on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Late Night Black and White, followed by The Pink Panther on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, the Land Before Time Marathon continues with the Land Before Time 3, the time of the great giving, right here on Cartoon Network. It's Mysteries, Inc., followed by Animaniacs on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, followed by Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's more Justice League, followed by He-Man on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's more Zoids, followed by G.I. Joe on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's more G.I. Joe, followed by Batman Beyond on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's more Batman Beyond, followed by Boomer Action on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Sheep in the Big City, followed by Mike, Lou, and Og on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Boomerang, followed by The Chuck Jones Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's more Baby Looney Tunes, followed by Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Cartoon the Top 5, followed by Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo, followed by Boomerang on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Summer Fridays on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy, followed by Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's X-Men Evolution, followed by Adult Swim on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Cartoon Theater, followed by a pup named Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door, followed by Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog, followed by the Powerpuff Girls on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, followed by the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Cartoon the Top 5, followed by Teen Titans on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Chuck Jones Show, followed by the Tex Avery Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Followed by Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory, followed by Tom and Jerry on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Totally Spies, followed by Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Jackie Chan Adventures, followed by Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Next, it's Codename Kids Next Door, followed by Totally Spies on Cartoon Network.